Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America by Andrew C. Mckevitt. Narrated by Bob Johnson. Aloof with hermit eye I scan the present works of present man, a wild and dreamlike trade of blood and guile, too foolish for a tear, too wicked for a smile. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Ode to Tranquility. Preface. America is the gun country. It might be the one point on which gun control and gun rights advocates agree, the former condemning it and the latter celebrating it. Not a gun country, but the gun country, the original, the touchstone, the incomparable paragon. There is simply nothing else like it anywhere on Earth, and there never has been. When the United States stood at the zenith of its global power in 1945, there were about 45 million guns and 140 million people in the country. Less than a quarter century later, the number of guns had doubled, while the population had increased only half as much. The era's baby boom was just a blip compared to the boom in guns. Another 25 years later, the stockpile had once again doubled, while population growth had slowed. By 2020, the U.S. population was not quite 2.5 times what it was in 1945, whereas there were nearly 10 times as many guns. America had become a nation with more guns than people, a condition unprecedented in world history. You could argue that the United States was always defined by its guns, even before it was an independent country. Historians have tracked guns through colonial North America, the Revolutionary Era, and the Wild West, through slavery, attempted indigenous genocide, and 19th-century continental expansion. Scholars have recounted and debated endlessly the origins and shifting meaning of the Second Amendment. But none of these histories explain how the country could have accumulated guns after the Second World War at a rate nearly 4 times faster than population, or how it managed to diverge so exceptionally from global patterns. Not only does the United States hold nearly half of all civilian-owned firearms in the world, but it has more than twice as many guns per person as any other country, 3 times as many as Canada, 6 times as many as Germany, and 120 times as many as Japan. No country, wealthy or poor, at war or at peace, anywhere on Earth, compares. And the stockpile continues to grow. The 2 biggest years on record for gun sales were 2020 and 2021, years fueled by a global pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, a contentious presidential contest resulting in the election of a Democrat promising new gun control initiatives, rising crime rates, and the violent attempt by supporters of President Donald Trump on January 6, 2021, to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. A University of Chicago survey indicated that 1 in 5 U.S. households bought a gun during the pandemic, and data suggested the population of new gun owners was growing more diverse. In what felt like a moment of unprecedented crisis, Americans turned to guns. It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. The first years of the 2020s demonstrated that guns are a visceral, material presence in Americans' lives, and yet the way we talk about gun history too often centers on abstractions like the Second Amendment, or rights, or law, or culture, rather than the changing material conditions that produced the gun country and placed nearly 500 million guns in the hands of 100 million people. Just about all of those guns have been bought and sold since 1945. As important as guns have been to the rich U.S. history of violence and conquest, why and how the country came to be so abundantly well-armed after the Second World War remains shrouded in myth. With rare exception, gun histories assume a natural state in which the supply of guns is simply always there, or the consumer demand is unswervingly insatiable, or both. But the gun country is not natural and immutable. It had to be made, and it could be unmade. To understand how America became the gun country, we need to investigate how and when the guns arrived, why so many people bought them, and how resistance to those developments worked in tandem with historical myths and evolving ideas about gun rights and American identity to shape what we call gun culture. To tell those stories, we must find the guns, and to find the guns in post-war America, we need to turn to the Cold War and consumer capitalism, the interconnected forces that produced America the gun country in the second half of the 20th century. Rather than start at the beginning, I want to tell you first about the story that compelled me to reckon with America the gun country over the past decade. It's a story about a boy named Yoshi. Introduction. 2 hours before his death in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on October 17, 1992, Yoshihiro Hattori, Yoshi to his friends, donned the white tuxedo jacket, ruffled shirt, and black polyester pants he had rented for a Halloween party that night. The 16-year-old exchange student from Nagoya, Japan, slicked back his hair, unbuttoned the shirt's top buttons to reveal his skinny chest, and hung a borrowed silver chain around his neck. Tonight he would be Tony Manero, the disco dancer brought to life by John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, 1977, a film almost as old as Yoshi was. For the past 2 months, Yoshi had attended McKinley High School, just blocks from the campus of Louisiana State University, where his host parents, Holly and Richard Haymaker, worked. In Japan, he'd been an accomplished student, but in Baton Rouge, Yoshi's nascent English skills made classes challenging. But he was funny, gregarious, and warm. He made friends quickly, and what he lacked in vocabulary he made up for with a disarming physicality. When he walked, he seemed to dance, lean, athletic, and graceful on his feet. He took jazz dance classes in Baton Rouge, and he liked to give impromptu performances for friends at school. This love for dance was responsible for the only time he'd found himself in any trouble. Teachers thought Yoshi's after-lunch shows were disruptive and worried he might have gotten too suggestive. The principal called the Haymakers to ensure that Yoshi got the message. No more dancing at school. The principal and teachers wouldn't be around tonight, though. Yoshi was headed to a party where he would mingle with other foreign exchange students, including another girl from Japan, and he meant to celebrate with his new friends by dancing like John Travolta. At about 7 p.m., he and Webb Haymaker, Richard and Holly's 16-year-old son, drove a red 1979 Volvo out of the Haymakers' upper-middle-class neighborhood. Webb, too, was in costume, dressed like an accident victim, which was not far from the truth. He wore a genuine neck brace, thanks to an errant dive into the family pool in August, which broke vertebrae in his neck and scared his parents half to death. They were headed to Central, a predominantly white lower-middle-class enclave about 20 miles away on the northeastern edge of the city. Webb was a smart and responsible kid, equipped with a hand-drawn map from his father, but he got lost anyway. He stopped for gas, then pulled into a post office parking lot to ask for directions. As they drove around town, the pair chatted about teenage boy things. Webb had spent 2 months now with Yoshi and understood him easily. Yoshi could struggle to find the best phrase to describe what he meant, and often waved his hands around as he talked, as if he were trying to pluck the right word from the air. Eventually, the boys found the street they were looking for. On the right side of East Brookside Drive was a row of small single-family homes. On the left, Central High School. Richard's hand-drawn map included the address for the party, 10311 East Brookside. Webb remembered it as a 3 and a 0 and some 1s. He made a pass down the road and turned around, seeing a house decorated for Halloween. The address, 10131, looked right. Webb didn't double-check his father's map, which he had tossed in the back seat. A little after 8 p.m., they hopped out of the car. Was this the place? The carport light was on, and the festive decorations matched the occasion. Webb thought they looked appropriately spooky. But he and Yoshi couldn't see or hear any party-like commotion. Webb knocked on the front door, or maybe he rang the doorbell, if there was one, he couldn't remember later, and nothing happened. Then the boys heard a noise in the carport. They moved to investigate and saw a small child peeking out the blinds of the carport door. As they approached, the child's mother, Bonnie Pierce, wearing a robe and glasses, opened the door. "Excuse me," said Webb, moving toward the door, shuffling alongside Bonnie's Toyota station wagon, Yoshi behind him. She quickly slammed the door. Clearly, this wasn't the right house. Webb and Yoshi walked back toward the car and stood on the sidewalk by the Pierce's mailbox, looking up and down the street, wondering where the party might be. Then the carport door swung open, loud enough for Webb and Yoshi to hear. They saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway, holding a gun made famous by another 1970s Hollywood icon, Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry, 1971. Inside 10131 East Brookside Drive, Rodney Pierce had just sat down to dinner, eggs and grits, washed down with a whiskey and Coke to take the edge off after a long day on the job at a local Winn-Dixie supermarket where he worked as a butcher. In contrast to Yoshi Hattori, who had traveled halfway around the world to Pierce's doorstep, 31-year-old Rodney had never lived outside of East Baton Rouge Parish. Rodney described himself as a country boy and had grown up in rural Zachary, about 20 miles north of the state capital. He claimed he didn't have a racist bone in his body, that he was raised in a family without prejudice. But his own son later said, and a previous wife confirmed, that Rodney and his father constantly used racial slurs. Investigators would be tipped off that Rodney's father had connections to the Ku Klux Klan. In a deposition, the elder Pierce admitted that he had been president of a local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of White People, the organization founded by infamous white supremacist David Duke in 1979 after his own break with the KKK. Rodney's father had taught him not only the white Southern tradition of race, but also the white Southern tradition of guns. Rodney kept 5 of them in the house, none of them locked up, even though 3 children lived there. One handgun, a .25 caliber pistol, had recently gone missing. It would later turn up in the room from which Rodney emerged into the carport that October night. Like many other Southern white men, Rodney had no formal training to handle any of his guns. He was the first generation to come of age in the era of the all-volunteer military, and he didn't volunteer. But he was comfortable firing them. He had shot stray animals on his father's farm in Zachary, and one time he killed a dog that had wandered into his backyard in Central. Rodney also thought of his guns as tools for defending himself, his family, and his home. Baton Rouge was in the midst of a half-decade climb in violent crime, even if it rarely touched predominantly white neighborhoods like Central. The era's crime spike was concentrated instead in working-class black neighborhoods, where the twin crises of poverty and the crack epidemic pinned in residents, an urban phenomenon replicated throughout the country in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Media in cities like Baton Rouge reproduced images of black urban violence, which provoked anxiety about street crime among the white residents of neighborhoods like Central. Yet random acts of violence by strangers were statistically rare in Central, as was the case just about everywhere else in the United States. Since the advent of reliable crime data in the mid-20th century, the vast majority of gun violence victims have known their shooters personally, and Rodney was especially worried about someone Bonnie knew all too well. Bonnie always seemed to be on edge. She forbade the children from looking out the windows if she wasn't home. She avoided grocery shopping at night for fear of being abducted. She wouldn't even put the garbage cans out to the curb after dark if she could see anyone walking down the street. It might have been the general panic about rising crime that got to her, though it may also have been her ex-husband. She had married him when she was just 16, and she claimed that he had been a drug dealer. Someone had stolen tools from the Pierce's carport recently, leading Rodney to suspect Bonnie's ex and to tell a neighbor, "If I ever catch him under my carport, I'll shoot him." It had all combined to leave Bonnie skittish, a neighbor said, afraid of her own shadow. When she heard a knock at the front door after 8 p.m. that Saturday night, Bonnie's internal alarms went off. She decided not to answer, hoping the visitors in the dark would go away. Her young son peeked out the blinds of the carport door and could see two people standing in the driveway. Bonnie opened the door halfway to get a better look, at which point the visitors approached. She could make out two teenagers, one who appeared to be hurt, and the other Oriental, Mexican, or whatever, she would later say. The injured one said, "Excuse me," as he moved toward her, sidling alongside Bonnie's Toyota station wagon. She slammed the door as adrenaline flooded her nervous system. In that moment, there was no thinking at all, she later recalled. She shouted to Rodney in the kitchen, "Get the gun!" Rodney rushed from the kitchen to the bedroom closet and found a case holding a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum 6-shot revolver, a massive handgun made famous by Eastwood's eponymous character in Dirty Harry. Rodney's was modified with a large scope, purportedly for hunting. Bonnie shoved her three kids into the bedroom and followed Rodney to the carport door. She said nothing to him about what she saw, and he didn't ask any questions. A minute hadn't passed from the time Bonnie slammed the door on Webb and Yoshi and the moment Rodney opened it, armed with one of the most powerful handguns ever made. When he heard the door swing open, Yoshi started back toward the carport. Maybe this was the house after all, he might have thought. "We are here for the party," he said, moving quickly up the driveway, light on his feet as always. But Webb could see that something wasn't right. The man was standing, silent, in a firing position, two arms extended, two hands gripping a large handgun. "Yoshi, no," Webb said. "Yoshi, come back." He followed Yoshi up the driveway at a more cautious pace. "Yoshi, come back." Bonnie stood behind Rodney. She told him to close the door. He ignored her. "We're here for the party," Yoshi repeated. "Freeze," shouted Rodney. "We are here for the party," Yoshi said again. Webb sensed Yoshi hadn't understood the command. As for Rodney, he later explained that he had waited on a lot of Orientals at the supermarket, but he struggled to understand them. He said he heard Yoshi say something that night, but it wasn't English. As he moved closer, Yoshi held up his hands in that way he tended to do when he was trying to make himself understood to English speakers. In his left hand, he gripped the camera he had used the last 2 months to take pictures of the sights of America, of new friends and family. Just a week earlier, in Baton Rouge, he had snapped some photos of a presidential candidate on the campaign trail named Bill Clinton. The criminal and civil trials that would follow the events of that evening were notable for how few of the facts of the incident were in dispute. The only one of significance concerned the distance between Yoshi and Rodney when Rodney pulled the trigger. Rodney claimed it was 3 to 5 feet, but was that 3 to 5 feet from Rodney's face or from his outstretched arms holding a gun? If the former, then pulling the trigger would have meant a near point-blank shot. The lawyers representing Yoshi's family would say, based on Webb's testimony, that it was between 6 and 8 feet, that Rodney had more time and distance to assess the potential threat. Walking quickly up the driveway and into the carport, Yoshi had reached the passenger-side rear door of Bonnie's Toyota station wagon when Rodney pulled the trigger, sending a .44 caliber bullet crashing through Yoshi's chest and out the other side. What was Rodney thinking in that moment? At the criminal trial, his lawyer, Louis Unglesby, a New Orleans character who could have been the invention of John Kennedy Toole, wanted jurors to believe that his client legitimately feared for his life. "This person is not afraid of my gun. He's not respectful of my property. He has no fear," Unglesby said, narrating Rodney's state of mind. "I wanted him to stop," Rodney said after the trial. "He didn't. He kept coming. The next thing I remember, I was scared to death. This person was not going to stop. This person was going to do harm to me." Unglesby encouraged jurors to think that light-on-his-feet Yoshi moved in a way that could be interpreted as aggressive, kinetic, and scary. "He would come right up to you as fast as he could," Unglesby said. Yoshi grabbed his chest and fell forward. Rodney slammed the door. locked it, and retreated to the bathroom. He vomited in the toilet, then went to the kitchen, placed the gun on the table, and waited for the inevitable arrival of the police. Bonnie stood behind him, grasping his shoulders and speaking in tongues, praying for salvation and perhaps for forgiveness. Webb knew immediately what had happened. He ran, crying and screaming hysterically, to the front door of the Pierce's neighbor, Stan Lucky, and told him to call 911. Lucky's wife called. It was 8:26 p.m., while Stan rushed outside with Webb. They found Yoshi just a step from the carport door, conscious, moaning and thrashing in agony. Stan elevated Yoshi's legs and told Webb to put pressure on the wound. He shouted for Bonnie's help, pleading with her to bring a towel, but he only heard her yell back, "Go away." Webb tried to communicate with Yoshi. "Can you talk to me?" he asked. Yoshi was able to say yes, but nothing else made sense. An ambulance arrived at 8:39 p.m., about 15 minutes after Rodney pulled the trigger. Yoshi remained conscious in the ambulance for 10 more minutes, eyes open, struggling to breathe, groaning. Then he stopped breathing, his lungs filled with his own vomit. He was dead by the time he reached the hospital. Deputies from the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Department arrived and detained Rodney. "Boy, I messed up," he told one as he got into the back of a car. "I made a mistake." But the deputies were not so sure. Louisiana's Castle Doctrine law, dating to the 1970s, permitted homeowners to use deadly force to defend themselves or others on their property. Rodney spent the night at the sheriff's office and gave a statement, but walked out of the station the next day, having convinced the sheriff that he had acted justifiably in self-defense and with no criminal intent. By Monday, news of the tragedy had reached Japan. Reporting from Tokyo for the Washington Post, T.R. Reid noted that what seemed like just another accidental killing for Americans was now a major national concern for Japan. Shooting deaths were rare in the country. There were fewer than 100 total annually in the 1990s, a figure that would drop to just 9 in 2018, compared to more than 30,000 in the United States. News reports fixated on the colloquial use of the word freeze. They displayed dictionary entries of the word that didn't include the definition stop moving. Nearly every Japanese learned some English in school, but few spoke it frequently enough that they might have understood Rodney's command. Much of the Japanese press took the commentary beyond simple confusion over the mechanics of the incident. "America, what a country," said Takashi Wada on TV Asahi. "You can't even walk around outside and be safe. Many people live in fear all the time over there." Tokyo Broadcasting System anchor Tetsuya Chikushi saw the shooting as indicative of a deep rot in U.S. society. "The gun lobby says this is a matter of freedom to have a gun," he said. "This is America's worst disease, I think. Guns everywhere. It's like a cancer." 8 months later, Rodney Pierce walked free when a Baton Rouge jury acquitted him of manslaughter charges. "You have the absolute legal right in this country to answer your door with a gun," said Unglesby, his lawyer, speaking to the press afterward. "In your house, if you want to do it, you have the legal right to answer everybody that comes to your door with a gun." Unglesby had used his peremptory challenges during jury selection to ensure that each of the jurors supported gun ownership, and juror questionnaires obtained by the Baton Rouge Advocate after the trial revealed that those jurors, 6 men, 6 women, 10 white, 2 black, were all concerned about the current level of crime in the city. Half of them owned guns. Questioned about crime and policing, one said, "Guns get into the hands of criminals too easily," while another wrote, "I'm afraid we may have too much gun control, which I don't believe will stop a criminal from getting a gun." In an interview after the trial, one juror said, "Anybody would have done the same thing." Some Baton Rouge residents agreed. "We're just prisoners in our neighborhoods," said a local businessman as he watched the scrum outside the courtroom after the verdict. It would be to me what a normal person would do under those circumstances. On the other side of the world, it was nearly unimaginable that such an outcome could be considered normal. There is no way you are going to convince Japanese that the reasonable action, even if you are terrified, is to shoot someone in the heart as soon as you open the door, University of Tokyo professor Masako Notoji told the New York Times. We are more civilized, she said. We rely on words. An American exchange student living in Japan through the same program that arranged Yoshi's stay in Baton Rouge described a chilling orientation for Japanese students heading to the United States after the verdict. The students had nervous questions about America and its guns. Daniel Todd Cohen tried to explain the constitutional roots of the right to bear arms in his very limited Japanese, but, as he recalled, he was usually countered by a Japanese proverb, a piece of Japanese history, or just a statement of common sense. An elementary school student asked Cohen why there was a war in America. Confused, Cohen responded that there was no war in the United States. Is America at peace, then? The child asked. Yes, of course, Cohen replied. Why are people always getting shot there? The student countered. If there is no war. When I first encountered Yoshi's story more than a decade ago, while writing a book about U.S.-Japan relations, I learned that his host family, the Haymakers, along with his heartbroken parents in Japan, Miyako and Masaichi Hattori, had launched an international gun control campaign after Yoshi's death. I found the Haymakers and Hattoris to be compelling characters, inspired by tragedy to coordinate a movement across national borders to address what seemed to be a uniquely American problem. Indeed, that was their pitch to the American people. It doesn't have to be like this. The tragedy and heartbreak of Yoshi's death multiplied tens of thousands of times every year, and Japan, a society of equivalent wealth and development with so few gun deaths, demonstrated it. Americans had bought into the mythology of gun exceptionalism, abetted by the quotidian reality of gun capitalism, their movement argued, and confronting gun violence meant challenging both gun myths and material culture. Yet by the 1990s, attitudes toward the gun country at home and abroad had calcified over the previous 2 decades, and even with their global perspectives, the Haymakers and Hattoris soon hit a wall. In making their appeal for justice, they joined a gun control movement divided over strategies and tactics after struggling to stem rising rates of gun ownership and violence since the 1960s. They were opposed by a strong gun rights movement, most prominently represented by the National Rifle Association, NRA, that had come to see even the most moderate of reforms as a slippery slope toward tyranny. They criticized a gun industry that had created new mass markets for home and self-defense in the 1970s and 1980s, cultivating fear for profit. As they organized, they befriended countless people in Japan and around the world, but even with global and domestic support, this American riddle remained intractable. The responses to Yoshi's killing felt so inflexible from the outset because the ideological and material patterns that produced them had ossified a quarter-century earlier. As I looked deeper, I learned that the activists inspired by Yoshi were not the first to ask why U.S. gun culture and violence stood in such great relief from the rest of the world. That question emerged in the 1960s at the center of the first significant post-war gun debate, as rebellions raged in cities across the country and assassins' bullets felled national heroes. As I investigated that history and combed through archives that scholars have rarely used to write it, I discovered that much of the rhetoric and ideas of the gun politics of the 1990s and of our gun politics today emerged in the years leading up to and following the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968, which, as a result, serves as a crucial turning point in the story that follows. These ideas were forged in the Cold War, draped in patriotism, anti-communism, and anti-globalism through and through. and yet they were inextricably linked to the consumer capitalism that emerged alongside the Cold War, the economic system that deftly
Sample complete. Ready to continue?